All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Picture the world in 1914. It was widely considered the absolute height of modern civilization, right? Thriving culture, high fashion, booming technology. And yet, it somehow stumbled into absolute, unimaginable chaos. Now sure, everyone kinda knew a big war might be brewing. You had France and Germany bickering over territory, and Germany was busy building up this massive navy that made the British incredibly nervous. But the way this global conflict actually kicked off, well, it's a story of sheer, mind-boggling coincidence.
It is honestly wild to think about. How does all that modern progress just entirely unravel over an open-top car ride? How does a cultured, technologically advancing global society devolve into a literal meat grinder? Well, the answer starts in a tiny corner of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You had Serbs and Bosnians there who were deeply, deeply unhappy with their rulers. And that localized regional tension set the stage for an event that really should have just been a minor historical footnote. But instead, it completely changed the course of human history.
Okay, get a load of this timeline, because the sheer absurdity of these coincidences is just unbelievable. The Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand decides to visit Sarajevo in an open-top car. And for some reason, they publish his route in advance. So, shocker, assassins are waiting for him. They throw bombs, but get this, they miss. They end up blowing up the officers in the car right behind him. Now, logically, you'd think the Archduke would immediately go into hiding and get out of town, right? Nope. He decides to go back out in that exact same open-top car to visit those injured officers in the hospital. Along the way, his driver takes a literal wrong turn. The car gets stuck trying to turn around, and by an absolute terrifying twist of fate, they end up parked right smack beside one of the failed assassins from earlier in the day. The guy takes his shot, and the Archduke is killed.
So, boom, the dominoes start falling. That one localized spark instantly activated this massive, unbelievably tangled web of alliances, dragging the entire continent into war practically overnight. Austria-Hungary is understandably furious, and they suspect the Serbian government is in on it. With their heavyweight ally Germany backing them up, Austria-Hungary sends Serbia this impossible list of demands. Serbia inevitably says no, so war is declared. But wait, Serbia is protected by Russia, and Russia is buddies with France. So suddenly, literally everyone is declaring war on everyone else. A regional spat just triggered a global chain reaction.
Now, Germany thought they had it all figured out. They desperately wanted to avoid fighting a war on two fronts, which brings us to the infamous Schlieffen Plan. They knew Russia was this massive beast, so they just assumed it would be really slow and clumsy to mobilize its army. The plan was pretty simple: smash into France at lightning speed, knock them out of the war, and then rush all those victorious troops over to the east to deal with Russia. But there was a huge roadblock. France had heavily fortified its shared border with Germany. So, to bypass those forts and save precious time, Germany decided they'd just march right through neutral Belgium. Let's just put this into perspective for a second. 750,000. Germany tried to shove 750,000 soldiers through a completely neutral country. They essentially gambled their entire grand strategy on the assumption that Belgium would just sit down, shut up, and let a massive foreign army use their front yard as a highway.
But, surprise, Belgium did not just roll over. They fought back hard. They were incredibly resilient and actually significantly slowed down the whole German advance. And the blowback from this was absolutely massive. First off, Britain was entirely outraged by the invasion of a neutral nation, so they instantly declared war on Germany. On top of that, as the Germans pushed through, they committed terrible atrocities. Couple that with their extremely intimidating uniforms, we're talking spike-topped helmets and literal skulls on their gear, and, well, it was a total global propaganda nightmare. The Allies ran with it. It even completely shifted public opinion over in America. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who originally just wanted everyone to hug it out, and even ethnic Germans living in the States, turned fiercely against the German war machine.
So as this war is rapidly escalating, all of these nations are charging in with a totally old-school mentality, and that leads to a really deadly culture clash. We have to ask, how did 19th century tactics fare against 20th century weapons? The short answer? Disastrously. Every single military involved quickly woke up to the terrifying reality that the technology of 1914 was like absolutely nothing they'd ever seen before.
It was a picture of absolute slaughter. Just imagine this. The French are marching out into the countryside, wearing bright blue coats and vivid red trousers. They were literally dressing up as colorful targets, slowly marching in these traditional, tight formations. And they were walking straight into a brutal new reality. The Germans were waiting for them with giant, hyper-modern artillery guns. The Germans could spot those bright blue and red columns from miles away and just tore them to shreds. It was a completely tragic, lethal mismatch, outdated tradition colliding head-on with industrialized firepower.
Meanwhile, let's check in on the Eastern Front. Remember how Germany's entire master plan banked on Russia being super slow? Well, they got a massive shock. Russia was ready for war way, way earlier than anyone expected. This threw a gigantic wrench into Germany's timeline. All of a sudden, that lightning-fast victory in the West wasn't happening, and a massive, mobilized threat was already knocking loudly on their back door in the East. Germany frantically looks to their ally, Austria-Hungary, to handle the Russians, but that situation was a total mess. The Austro-Hungarian chief of staff was reportedly a very handsome guy, but an absolutely terrible military strategist. He completely ignored German advice, and his forces couldn't even handle tiny Serbia. They got repelled in all their initial invasions. Because Austria-Hungary constantly needed bailing out, Germany had to hit the panic button and redirect critical troops away from France and back over to the east. Remarkably, though, the Germans did pull off a massive success up north, managing to almost completely wipe out the Russian Second Army.
Let's pivot back to the Western Front because things were reaching a serious boiling point. The Germans had advanced so aggressively that they were literally within sight of Paris. It looked like a quick victory was in the bag. But then, the French commander ordered his retreating armies to just stop, turn around, and fight back. In the absolute chaos of that clash, a massive gap opened up right in the middle of the German lines. And in warfare, if you leave a gap, you're gonna get flanked. So to avoid being completely surrounded, the Germans were forced to pull back and start digging into the earth for defense. The Allies immediately did the exact same thing. Both armies then spent weeks basically trying to sidestep each other, digging further and further north to outflank the other side, until they literally ran out of land and hit the ocean. The results? An unbroken, massive line of trenches stretching all the way from the coast down to the Swiss border. The Great Stalemate had officially begun.
And that brings us to a phrase you've definitely heard before: no man's land. It defined the harsh, unimaginable reality of trench warfare. It's almost impossible to truly fathom the horror of this space between the two armies. It was this perpetually muddy, wet wasteland packed with deep shell craters and dense, tangled barbed wire. It was essentially a lethal killing zone completely dominated by relentless machine gun fire. And this was the nightmare that soldiers were forced to stare out at every single day. It is honestly stomach-churning to think about what daily life was actually like for these guys. One side would just absolutely pummel the other with hundreds of thousands of artillery shells, sometimes for days on end, without a single break. It caused severe, devastating psychological shell shock. And then a whistle would blow. Soldiers had to climb out and make these purely suicidal rushes straight across no man's land into a wall of bullets, taking thousands of casualties just to gain maybe a few meters of mud. Down in the trenches, they lived shoulder to shoulder with corpses, giant disease-ridden rats, and an insane smell that you couldn't even describe. The mud was so treacherous and bottomless it could literally swallow a person whole, right alongside pools of stagnant, poisonous water.
So, wrapping up this explainer, it leaves us with a genuinely haunting question. How on earth could the so-called height of civilization justify throwing millions of young men into this horrific, disease-ridden existence for years on end? Military commanders ordered them into this meat grinder day after day after day. And when you trace it all back, this unprecedented global nightmare was sparked by the most absurd series of coincidences, ultimately coming down to a single, literal wrong turn in a car in Sarajevo. It really forces us to stop and wonder if an isolated, seemingly random incident in 1914 could cause the entire world to burn. What invisible dominoes might be quietly lining up in our own modern world today?